it was an evolution of various kinds of much older games. China has a long and rich history of game development, and Mahjong came out of a combination of several different much older forms of games. So there are long roots, but as we know it today, Mahjong started in the mid to late 1800s, started to spread along major urban centers in China, and Shanghai, and the area around Shanghai, is really what becomes what I call the crucible of Mahjong, and that's where the game develops as we know it today. By the late 1800s, so 1880s, 1890s, there's a thriving courtesan culture in Shanghai, and Mahjong is a part of it. And here you can see a courtesan hall with these female entertainers and their male clients playing Mahjong here at the table. And it also, by the 1910s, becomes a strong way of making business connections, including business connections between Chinese businessmen and a growing number of American expatriates who were joining the British and other Europeans who were in this treaty port city of Shanghai. And this is after World War I. The United States is becoming an increasing economic power, particularly in Asia, but around the world. And American expatriates become the key to bringing Mahjong to the wider world. And it becomes very popular in social clubs. This is the American Social Club, built in 1925. It was a big deal. They invested $1 million into building this building. And you'll notice it's very Western architecture, except for one room inside, which was the Mahjong room. It was incredibly popular in this community in the 1920s in Shanghai, in the American community. And you'll notice that there's these strong kind of intentional influence of Chinese architecture, and that is the only room where that is the case. So one of the ways that it was able to spread to Americans is during this time, there was an addition of this little number in the corner of the tile, so that you didn't have to understand, you didn't have to be able to read the Chinese number, which is, this is the number 6, that you could have the 6 in the corner, and then you would, you could still understand it even if you didn't know Chinese numbers. So that was an important development. And the Americans started bringing the games to the United States by many different routes. Tourists brought them back to give to friends and family. But one of the most important people importing the game was Joseph Babcock. And we'll talk a little bit about him again in a minute. But in the 1920s, it was an enormous fad. It was a new and exotic game, and it crossed regions across the United States, across social classes. Men and women were playing it, although by the end of the decade, in the United States, Mahjong becomes known mostly as a women's game. In the beginning, that wasn't true. It was more similar to bridge. And Mahjong sets actually becomes Shanghai's 6th largest export to the United States. Americans buy more than $1.5 million worth of sets in 1923. And the American market was the largest at the time, although it was also becoming very popular in Japan and in Western Europe, again, these other imperial powers that were in, particularly Shanghai at the time. But the American market helps explode it on a global scene because it is becomes a huge and overnight market. The peak of the fad is 1922 to 1925. And it really hits at a time of a full takeoff of mass marketing techniques. There's advertising, catalogs, store displays, and this is a photograph from Bullock's department store in Los Angeles. And this photograph is from the Huntington Library in Pasadena, and you can see here there's a shop girl kind of dressed up again in these ideas of what a Chinese outfit might look like, and there's a whole mishmash of different decorations that were meant to allow to draw customers in and give them an experience of, quote, the Orient. And here is the glass case then of many different kinds of Mahjong sets for sale, as well as various accoutrements. There is a doll up here. You'll see a Mahjong doll in the exhibit. So this was a new sales technique to have these kind of experiential corners. So it enters primarily through California, and San Francisco is really important in that story. Port of San Francisco is a major entry for mahjong into the United States, and it quickly diffuses nationally to New York City, along the east and west coasts, and then inland. And here's a quick trivia. Just your guesses. In the 1920s, what material do you think most mahjong tiles were made out of?
Ivory. Bakelite.
I hear ivory, bakelite. Any other guesses?
Well, the ones you pass around.
Bamboo.
Yeah.
Wood.
Wood.
Great. So, ready?
Found in bamboo. Yeah.
So, and you're right. This is kind of a trick question because, in fact, all of these materials were used to make tiles, but most of them in these very early years were made out of bone and bamboo that were spliced together. And that was intentionally meant to evoke this appearance of ivory. Ivory had a lot of status associated with it, had for a long time. So it was seen as more valuable because it looked like ivory. And ivory sets did exist, but extremely, extremely, extremely rare. Fortunately for the elephants. But most of them were bone spliced together with bamboo. And there are lots of different ways of telling the different quality and things like that, but that was where how most were being made. And they were being made in and around Shanghai, by and large. That was this growth of this manufacturing. And these are two craftsmen making them. They were all made entirely by hand. And these are baskets of bones that they're using.
Wow.
Here you can see the caption is
Shin bones.
cow bones, cow shin bones. It says the first process in making mahjong, cutting shin bones from USA. They actually ran out of the Chinese supply of cow bones because this was such a huge market. In part because the area of the bone that you could actually use to make these tiles was not a very big area in a shin bone, in the cow shin bone, because it had to be a specific thickness and a specific evenness. So you moved through a lot of bones. But also, Chinese agriculture did not rely on cows as much as the United States does. Cows take a huge number of resources. At that point, Chinese agriculture was much more kind of resource intensive because there wasn't enough to go around. And so they were importing steamships of cow bones via Texas often, but from Chicago shipyards to Shanghai to then export back as a finished product of mahjong tiles. And the price of bone actually went sky high in that period as well, just for these few key years. But it's a big resource bottleneck. It's a very time-intensive process. So again, many different people were bringing them to the United States. And I mentioned Joseph Babcock. Well, he and his wife Norma and his business partners formed the Mahjong Sales Company of America. And it was a major engine for promoting the game and bringing the game to the United States. And this is his patent. He definitely claimed in court, he brought people to court multiple times, that he was the first and only person, that this was his game, he had created it. We're pretty sure that's not true. But he certainly was very important in bringing it, and you can see then this original configuration of his standardized images in the sets that were made under his company name.
What was his company name called?
The Mahjong Sales Company of America. And he was the one who added the 2 G's on the end of Mahjong as a kind of trademarked term. So who was playing it? Again, so many different groups of Americans were playing it. It became such a popular thing that everyone was at least talking about it, even if they weren't playing it. So cross social classes, but the group that was most strongly associated with the game in popular culture were elites. And here you can see a group of, it's a little bit hard to see, I apologize, but there's a group of wealthy, young, fashionable socialites who are gathered around. And again, if you'll notice, they're wearing what they perceive to be Chinese costume, okay? And you'll see that again throughout these images. Here, you don't have to be young to do this. You can be a wealthy matron, a socialite who hosts elaborate mahjong fundraisers where people have to come, again, dressed in a, quote, Chinese costume. But you could also be a middle-class housewife in Atlanta. This is a newspaper, the Atlantic Constitution, explaining to people how they too can host mahjong parties for their friends, where, again, you kind of dress in more homespun costumes and you can serve appropriate food and have your little Pekingese dog there too. And through these pictures you'll notice, again, these various ideas, the various forms of community. We saw that group of young women playing together, the matrons hosting these philanthropic fundraisers, and again, a kind of smaller scale hosting that happened as part of the fad. But there were also big productions and more kind of official performance. If we think of the people dressing up as costumes as individual performance, well, there was also performance on stage. And this is, these are costume designs by the very important and famous Art Deco designer Erte. These images are actually from the Met in New York, and these were his original costume designs for a Dancing Girls revue. It was George White's Scandals, which was a lot like Ziegfeld Follies and was at the same time, that was devoted to the theme of mahjong that year. And so these are then women dressed up as kind of elements of the game. And in the exhibit, what's great is that you'll see a photograph of a dancing girl in one of these costumes, what it actually looks like when it comes to life. And I saw these images first before I saw that photograph, and I was a little disappointed because these are so elaborate and beautiful. And of course, the real life ones are not quite as elaborate, but they're really, I mean, they have some fabulous headdresses like that. And you'll notice these are actually very, very risque costumes. And indeed, there were some risque dances in real life, but the costumes are a little more conservative than the ones you can see here. So there were stage performances. If you were wealthy and had a garden, you might invite your friends over to host a mahjong play, and you could cast your friends in the various elements of the game. Of course, the East Wind, and sometimes the East Wind Princess is very important in these. You might also read Auction Bridge and Mahjong magazine. And I want to pause at this cover here. I think it's a really great example of some of these themes that we can see in the massive cultural production that happened during the 1920s. You can see the kind of positive draw of the game. There's a lot of beauty. There's this performative element of, again, dressed up in costume. There's a sense of kind of exoticism. And there's this also slightly ominous Chinese presence represented by the dragon in the background. And I think that this encapsulates also some of the stereotypical elements that you see throughout so many of these representations and stereotypes of Chinese culture. And so not all of these representations were positive. This is a cartoon from Harper's Magazine that is entitled The Yellow Peril. So again, very in trying to be humorous, thinking of being humorous, is evoking this past of really violent anti-Chinese, anti-immigration sentiment. And the cartoon makes fun of both this socialite and her caricatured laundryman, because she's inviting him in to play mahjong with her friends. And of course, he looks completely stereotypical. So from its introduction into American society, newspapers, advertisers, popular media consistently discussed mahjong and explicitly discussed mahjong as an embodiment of Chinese culture, but specifically this idea of an ancient and royal Chinese court. And a lot of it was very stereotypical and underwrote this idea of unassimilability that haunted Chinese Americans in this time and in many ways to today as well. Legally, they could not become naturalized citizens because there was a belief that no matter what, no matter how many years they were here, they were always inherently foreign. And this 1920s was a time major time of very strong anti-immigrant sentiment, and a revived second Ku Klux Klan. And so there was this moment of, on one hand, fascination with a Chinese game, and on the other hand, a real anti-immigrant, broadly anti-immigrant sentiment. As one kind of another complex representation is a very popular song at the time, since Ma is playing mahjong. And does anyone know Eddie Cantor?
Yeah.
He's a very talented vaudevillian. He himself was Jewish, was really important in paving the way for Jewish performers. He helped, and vaudeville had, if you know the history of vaudeville incorporated a lot of racial and often racist humor in its performance as part of American culture at the time. And he helped popularize this song, since Ma is playing mahjong, and the refrain that you hear over and over again through this song is a really actually disturbing joke, but it was meant to be and perceived to be humorous at the time, where Pa, the father of the family, goes out and hangs Chinese people because Ma, his wife, left dishes in the sink and was generally neglectful because she was too busy playing mahjong. And one of the lines is, "China, you're poison to me, you broke up my whole family." But it's this really bouncy, very fun song, and if you listen to it, it will get stuck in your head, which is unfortunate because of the lyrics. And so part of this time, too, was also a pushback against this female community that we've talked about as women's leisure, as frivolous, as distracting, and there were social reformers who were concerned that mahjong was leading to juvenile delinquency because mothers were not paying attention to their children, they were too busy playing this foreign game. So there was some pushback to that, but there was also, inherent in this is returning to this idea of a darker side of building community. I think that because all the stereotypical representations of imagined ancient Chinese culture was explicitly separated from the working class Chinese Americans who were living in the United States at the time, I think a lot of this actually unintentionally helped reinforce this idea of Chinese Americans as outside a national American community, as inherently separate. So as we go on, I think that there are, again, multiple ways to think about community. But moving on in time, after the mid and particularly late 1920s, articles start declaring mahjong dead, as the fad is over. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. These are all kind of different historical moments, and the historical moments change. But part of that, too, was that there was a proliferation of different styles. There were so many different rule books, in part because Babcock was out there trying to sue people who used his rules. They would come up with different rules of playing. And so then, and they were all saying this is the right way, this is the authentic way, this is the true way. And so then it became hard to establish how people wanted to play. And that was part of it. I think there were other reasons too. But the other question is, who is the game really dead for? In fact, people continued playing the game, and it retains its use for multiple groups, even as this kind of national massive bubble does burst. And one of these groups was Chinese Americans, who were also playing in the 1920s. And here you can see actually two instructors, again in Los Angeles, teaching a group of women. And for them, this massive fad was a kind of complicated economic opportunity. On one hand, it gave them an option for an often well-paying job in a very discriminatory economy, and they could advertise themselves as, quote, authentic mahjong players, but in so doing, they also risked reinforcing some of these stereotypes. But many people did work as instructors or as kind of like human props, again, in those department store displays to add this air of authenticity. But within the Chinese American community, this American fad that was associated with super elites, the Vanderbilts were playing, President Harding and First Lady Harding were playing. Everyone was talking about this. It helped increase the profile and the popularity of the game for Chinese Americans as well. And it also helped make it more flexible. It was no longer just a male gambling game. It also became a family game, and respectable Chinese women started playing it for the first time. Respectable kind of everyday women. And Chinese American to this day remains both a men's and a women's game. And Chinese Americans continued playing it during the 1930s through the Great Depression, and particularly for this second and third generation who are coming of age as Chinese Americans, I think that the game might have had special resonance as both this American fad and a Chinese game. And within families too, if you had multi-generational disconnect sometimes and language barriers, the game has its own rhythm, and you can spend time together without having a lot of pressured conversation. You can just spend time together and play. So I think that it served a special purpose. It also brought the broader community together in different ways. This is a replica of a kind of standard Chinese Chinatown store in Seattle, and very often mahjong games would be in the backs of community stores, mixing lots of different people together. And there was this connection to the United States, but also especially a connection to China in the late 1930s that was becoming increasingly important in the face of Japanese aggression. And people would use mahjong as fundraisers for war relief. So quick trivia, which Chinese holiday is a traditional time, do you think, for just generally?
Chinese New Year.
Yeah, exactly, of course. And this is, again, you can see a multi-generational Chinese family playing mahjong. This is in Australia, in the corner. And if you'll notice, Gong Si Fa Cai, which you say at the Chinese New Year, look at the tile. Fa is the same as, which tile is this?
Crap.
The green dragon. Yeah.
Oh, that's
yeah.
the dragon?
Yeah. So this is so this means fortune, and you can see it's fortune is a good thing, and in Chinese mahjong you get different points for different combinations of tiles too. So that would be a special boost. But in the late 1930s, another key development happens, and very important for American mahjong. Anyone know?
The League.
The
National
League!
Yeah.
The National Mahjong League is formed in 1938 in New York City. Women come, they send out a call, and over 200 women come to this hotel, this luxury hotel and apartment building on the edge of Central Park, the Essex House. They convene, and from New York City and from all the surrounding regions, and out of that is a core group of National Mahjong League directors. And they are among the groups of Americans who continued playing. Again, there were many pockets of Americans who liked the game and kept playing it regardless of the fad, and they were among them. And they were, that core group were Jewish women, and they linked to each other and the game from the beginning to Jewish women's philanthropy. And actually Dorothy Meyerson, who is one of the founders of the League, she had been selling a book of her rules, which is one of the origins of what becomes the rule card. She was selling it before the League was formed as a fundraiser for her synagogue on Long Island, Forest Hills. And she ends up making then these rule books. That's it, which as she gets involved with the League, this is from the 1950s, which are in many ways an elaboration then of the rule cards that came out every year. So this is 1938, just a few years later, World War II erupts, and most Americans experience massive disruption, a real upsurge in patriotism, and because mahjong can be used as a fundraiser, it gets linked into these patriotic fundraisers really quickly after the League is formed. And so, again, I had mentioned Chinese Americans had been hosting kind of fundraisers that would bring many Americans to experience various aspects of accessible Chinese culture, including mahjong as fundraisers for war relief or China relief. Even before the war starts, women are using mahjong as fundraisers for refugee relief with Jewish refugees from the Holocaust that is beginning. And during the war then, they fundraise for things like this mobile canteen, which is in a truck that drives around Manhattan offering respite and relief to servicemen who are stationed on, servicemen and women who are stationed on guard in Manhattan during the war. And there's a lot of different recipients of their fundraising. And quick question here, just off the top of your head, who do you think might have been the top 3 recipients of their individual fundraising in 1943? And by that I mean the individual members could request where they wanted the portion of their proceeds to be going. If they sold a certain number of memberships and rule cards, they could then request their own designated charity. But the league itself also has own. So these are the individual recipients. Yes, yes?
The Army and Navy Committee of Westside Defense Council, New York City.
Okay.
Greater New York Fund. And American Red Cross.
Okay, great. Any others?
Overseas Cigarette
Cigarette Club?
I would guess you, Talia.
You fell, yeah. Okay, let's find out. Okay, all right. We got some good spread here. So yes, you can see how, again, there's this combination of patriotic and war relief fundraisers, and also specifically making sure that they're channeling resources to refugee relief, where Youth Aliyah was linked to Hadassah, bringing orphans and children, refugees from Europe to Palestine at the time. And these were the top 3. However, this is also a trick question, because all of these organizations were recipients that year. These are just the top 3. And you can tell we were living in a different historical time, because what becomes the American Cancer Society was not seen as kind of canceling out the Overseas Cigarette Club. And in fact, that year, the League sent over 20,000 cigarettes to servicemen overseas as a kind of, as a comfort from home. So what else happened in World War II? There was so much geographic disruption also, particularly for members of the military and Japanese Americans who were interned, taken out of their homes on the West Coast and moved to internment camps. And Mahjong was there too. Mahjong was a community building tool, particularly for these transient overnight communities, a military base or an internment camp, again where people are being moved multiple times from one base to another and between one camp and another. And Mahjong was one of the approved recreational activities in internment camps, and it was also has become a long-lasting tool for particularly Air Force bases and Air Force officers' wives all over the world today. They play their own version of Mahjong. And so it's become this long-lasting strand, but in World War II it was common in the military for servicemen as well. Now in the 1950s and 60s is when what we call American Mahjong, when that culture really takes off. And you'll see this picture in the exhibit, I believe, as well. It's from the 1960 League Bulletin, and here the League members are coming together to play the game and experiment to make the hands for the next year's card. And they're designating the hands for the 1960 card, but the next year, the same group of women made the decision to integrate jokers for the first time. So this is a really key time in the development of American Mahjong, and this is really, 1960 is really one of the peak times in this development of this rich post-war culture. And it becomes particularly associated with Jewish American women at this time, particularly second-generation children of Eastern European immigrant parents, and often middle class who went to conservative synagogues. But these were not and this was a major group, and these people were super important in the development of Mahjong culture. They were never the only ones playing it. Again, one of the things that I keep saying is it was mostly associated with this group, but they were never the only ones. And that's true then too. Oftentimes Italian neighbors might learn, particularly from Jewish neighbors, but In more liberal Orthodox circles, you also will have families playing mahjong. So it's many different places, but this becomes a kind of core culture. And it overlaps with suburbia, which again is a kind of new type of community. These places where people are arriving, often for the first time, moving away from more multi-generational families, and are living with people who share that same experience, who are often in these very homogenous communities, and Jewish American women are disproportionately participating in that, and they're disproportionately leaving the workforce to take care of children when they are at home, young children when they are at home, although many of them also re-enter the workforce after their children are in school. And they tend to be highly educated, they tend to have fewer children, and there were many, many different organizations that came out of this at this time. There was a stereotype, of course, of a kind of stay-at-home housewife, but most of these women were very active in various ways. And they were active in ways that kind of gave back to their communities, but they were also active in mahjong. And I think mahjong is special for creating a sense of women's recreation and leisure. It was one of the only places I've gotten to talk to a lot of people who said that was the only time my mom went out without my dad. That was her night out, and it was okay for her to just be with the ladies. That was pretty unusual. And it becomes a really powerful way to meet people in these new communities when you need to meet people. It also overlapped with the Catskills and the real flourishing of this particularly Jewish American vacation culture in the Catskills hotels and bungalows. Oh yeah, this picture, of course, is in the exhibit. It's a wonderful picture of also mahjong at the Catskills. And in people's homes, which again might look like the kind of stereotypical classic suburban home, or might look more like, you might call it urban-ish or suburban-ish, might be a cooperative in the Bronx, it might be a row house in Brooklyn or outside of Detroit, or in this case, Philadelphia. This is a row house in Philadelphia that a woman had moved from her parents' home in interior Philadelphia to this that was slightly on the edge of Philadelphia in a row house, and then later moved to a more kind of classic suburban home. Mahjong helped connect these various places. So yeah, it's a fabulous picture, and here this group of friends remained a close Mahjong group for many years.
What I find interesting is the cover over the table.
Yes.
I thought that was a fairly recent thing, like in the last, 20 years.
Right.
And now everybody's got to have a cover for the card table. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an individual thing, but even in the 20s, you'll have people selling covers, in part because, for some people it can be very, very loud, but particularly if you've got a really thick plastic tile that are starting to come out in this post-war time. But yeah, some people also embroider covers or have this wonderful whole culture of things that emerge out of Mahjong. It becomes such a powerful tool for building a community that I've also talked to people who didn't play Mahjong, and they could feel a little left out because it was so ubiquitous, it was such an effective way that people got together, that if you didn't participate, you were kind of on the outs. So again, there's this always the double sides of community building. And during this time too, it becomes particularly linked to a sense of what it meant to be a Jewish American woman. And I've talked to people who grew up near the game or who were husbands who therefore never touched the game because it was a women's game. But in other words, people who were close to the game but never actually interacted with it enough to recognize that these were Chinese tiles, who thought that it was a Jewish game that people had brought from Eastern Europe, who thought that Mahjong was a Yiddish word. It becomes that closely linked. So again, through our talk today, we've looked at community in these various forms, from the business networks in 1910 Shanghai, to Americans playing everywhere across the nation in the 1920s, Chinese Americans in the 1930s, disrupted communities in World War II, and these post-war new suburban groups. In the 1970s, American Mahjong enters a little bit of a dip, and I think there are multiple reasons for that we can also talk more about in the Q&A. But part of that was a larger sense of, like I said, these things grow and decline in their own historical moment. And this made sense in a specific historical moment that moved into a different historical moment that didn't have as much resonance. But it was also the 1970s and 1980s were also a major time of Mahjong diversification. In 1965, the Asian Immigration Reform passed, and there has been ongoing massive, diverse forms of Asian immigration that have brought a lot of different styles of playing. Filipino Mahjong culture is different from Japanese Mahjong culture, which is different from Chinese Mahjong culture, and there are so many different ways of playing Chinese Mahjong. There's Sichuan and Shanghai and Hong Kong, and they're all different, and it's become more of a table rules game in contemporary communities. And at the same time, there are also ongoing American-based groups, like the Air Force group I mentioned, called Wright-Patterson rules. Some places, like there's a Virginia country club that plays 1920s rules. So you'll have these pockets that have remained. And I think that since the 1990s in particular, there's been a revival. But this is a group of women I interviewed in Manhattan for my research who are still playing. And this is a group from the 1970s of Chinese American women who are playing. So again, there has been continuity, even though there's also been disruption. And I think part of why there's been a revival since the 1990s is because of Hollywood. Mahjong has re-entered popular culture a little bit. So last trivia, which movie
Joy Luck Club.
was it not in?
Oh.
Yeah, so I know it's tricky. On the SATs, these are always the worst questions.
Lust, caution.
All right, okay, I'll just take 3 guesses. What's one? I heard Lust, Caution,
Lust,
so you're thinking
Caution.
not in that one.
Definitely under
Definitely, okay, you're thinking it's definitely interested.
Definitely Joy Luck Club.
Driving Miss Daisy.
Driving Miss Daisy. Okay, anyone that was a final guess for
not in the Joy Luck Club.
But it's not in the Joy Club?
No,
It
it
is.
is. It is.
Let's find out. Which one? It's counterintuitive.
Oh,
It's not in Dirty Dancing.
And I really think that is historically inaccurate. I just rewatched it. I love that movie. And I rewatched it just waiting for the Mahjong, and I never saw it. So if I somehow missed it, if it's in the background of one of the scenes, please let me know. But I think that they were misinformed and did not include it because it's the Catskills in the 1960s. It probably would have been there. However, it is in fact in Driving Miss Daisy. Miss Daisy, one of the ways that they show that she's Jewish is actually because she's linked with this Mahjong group in a specifically Mahjong Jewish community in the South. There are also non-Jewish Mahjong players in the South, as a side note, but not in the movie. The Joy Luck Club Mahjong helps structure the game. It helps bring these generations together. And Less Caution, for those who don't know it, is a recent film by Ong Lee, based off of a 1940 short story by Eileen Zhang, that where Mahjong is shown in 1940 Shanghai, Japanese occupied Shanghai, that is shown to be this place of intrigue and negotiation and spying. So Mahjong is a part of that story as well. So I'm excited for you all to get to spend time in the exhibit, and I really welcome your questions now. But again, if you have any interest, or if you know people who might want to talk to me, again, either positive or negative associations with the game, please give me a call or send me an email, and also any photographs or memorabilia as well. So, oh, sorry, this got cut off, but this is just my website that people can also reach me through. It's amheinz, my last name, .org.